way to a wonderful life message for today is revealing Jesus' truth. Revealing Jesus' truth. And let's just get into that consciousness of believing and accepting that Jesus was someone that we should all find in our heart, not only in our mind, but in our heart as well, and know that as he demonstrated the truth that he believed and accepted as the truth of his relationship with God, his relationship with each and every one of us, that as we follow him, we must find that relationship with God within our own self and with each other, knowing that that is that connection in the Spirit, that living Spirit within every living thing that is a part of God. And we read in the book of Psalms 118 in the Holy Bible and the written Torah, which we can read, "Oh, give thanks unto the Lord, for he is good, because his mercy endureth forever. I called upon the Lord in distress. The Lord answered me and set me in a large place. This is the day which the Lord hath made. We will rejoice and be glad in it. Thou art my God, and I will praise thee. Thou art my God, I will exalt thee. O give thanks unto the Lord, for he is good, for his mercy endureth forever." And just as Jesus tells us that the Father is a spirit, and we must worship him in spirit and in truth, we know that these statements from the book of Psalms is just giving us a greater recognition, a way in which to recognize the presence of God that is available to each and every one of us all the time. Throughout the ancient scriptures, we find words that reveal to us that God responds to us, not just some of us, but all of us. As Jesus tells us that sowing and reaping law of the universe is always present, always active. It's universal. There's no respecter of persons. So the Mastermind Jesus' message throughout his 3 years of teaching and demonstrating the truth, he taught us all to develop our consciousness by looking to God, looking to the good, and increasing our measure of faith, but realizing that it only takes a small faith to have wonderful things happen in our life. When we understand the nature of God, then we will find that we understand the teachings of Jesus in a greater way. So as we understand the nature of God, we understand that during the last Passover supper, Jesus attempted to illustrate our unity with and our power to appropriate the Spirit, the intelligence, the power of the Spirit. Simply put, this means that we can use God, and God uses us to do, to be, and to enjoy the abundance of good that God has made available to us, both seen and unseen, those things of the Spirit and those things in the material. Those who believed the Mastermind Jesus were inspired. Those who feared him called him a heretic. He had spent his entire life preparing himself for these 3 years of living and teaching and demonstrating the truth, teaching that God indwells us, that it is the Christ that we must discover within ourselves, because it is the very life within us, the very power within us, to do and to be and to have those things that God desires for us to have. His attempts to frame this movement of consciousness in words that those around him could understand and actualize in their own life experiences resulted in parables that contained such profound universal truth that spiritual seekers all over the world continue to study and meditate on those words. As we look at these words from Jesus from the Gospel of Luke 19:41, he says, "And when he was come near, he beheld the city and wept over it." That's what it tells us in the Gospel of Luke. And when he was come near, when Jesus got near the city, he beheld the city and wept over it. And so we realize that Jesus had that feeling of human emotion. He had that feeling of love for everybody, and he was so sad to see that the world continued to listen to those things that were just given to them from other people's opinions and ideas rather than discovering their own truth within themselves. And so he wept over the city. That as he beheld the city, he wept over it. What a wonderful, wonderful heart he must have had. Softly and tenderly, Jesus is calling for you and for me. And these words from the old spiritual song have always reminded me that Jesus called us to love one another. Love one another. He wasn't attempting to start a revolution or a new religion, but to evolve the idea of God's love for everyone. Just as we read in the book of Jeremiah, I have loved thee with an everlasting love. I have loved thee with an everlasting love. And Jesus was telling us, bind this within your heart as the truth for you. But he knew that his message was not being understood by the people. Those who were inspired by him wanted the king, not spiritual understanding. They wanted to overthrow the visible powers, the powers of authority and politics, not grasp the awareness of spiritual power. Those who were against him feared his growing influence to inspire people to think for themselves and to question both the power of the government and the power of the religious leaders. For those who have read the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we can easily find the contradictions which reveal that even the Gospel writers could not fully comprehend the evolutionary spiritual philosophy of the mastermind Jesus. Who could comprehend a man who had such a fullness of the Spirit within his consciousness that he did not fear physical death? He was fearless. Fearless. This doesn't mean that he didn't believe that he could be put to death, but he was fearless in knowing that he was in God, that he would always be in God, that God is all there is, either here or in the hereafter, that each and every one of us can find that truth within our own mind, our heart, and our soul as we go deep into our hearts, deep into our soul, and ask for that realization of it. Incline your ear and come to me and listen. We read in the Scriptures, and God will reveal to us that that's the truth for all of us, and we too can become fearless. It was the Christ within Jesus that transcended fear and uncertainty and strengthened him to do that which he believed was his to do. His disciples had failed to embody the consciousness as evidenced by the well-known denial by Peter and the lesser-known denial of 10 other disciples. As Jesus had fully revealed the Christ consciousness within himself, he was ready to prove to the world that God is life and life is God, both here and in the hereafter. Now, the great teacher Eric Butterworth writes in his book, Discover the Power Within You. He writes, on the cross, one of the most misunderstood of the dramatic 7 last words of Jesus is Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that last word correctly. It's S-A-B-A-C-H-T-H-A-N-I. It's in the Aramaic. It's from the Gospel of Matthew 17:46. This has been rendered, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? How unfortunate has been this mistranslation. We must understand that the Bible was originally written in the Greek, but the people in Jesus' surroundings spoke the Aramaic language. Jesus spoke the Aramaic language, so there are mistranslations. Just like in Spanish, there are words that we don't have in the English language, and in the English language, there are words that we don't have in the Spanish language. How unfortunate, Eric Butterworth says, has been this mistranslation, for if God would or could forsake this most advanced soul, Jesus, then what hope is there for us? How can we, or why should we, worship and love a God who would ordain or even acquiesce in this horrible experience? So now we know that Jesus' words have been totally misunderstood. George Lanza, the world-renowned Syrian scholar and translator of the Bible from the ancient Peshitta, that's P-E-S-H-I-T-T-A, says that Jesus was actually saying, my God, for this I was kept. I am fulfilling my destiny. I am on the way through the dark hour to the great demonstration of resurrection and the complete fulfillment of man's divinity. In other words, he was proving to all of us that the physical body is not our life, that our life is spirit, and our spirit is part of God. That means our spirit is eternal. Reading the Scriptures literally brings us up short in understanding consciousness, especially the Christ consciousness embodied by the mastermind Jesus. But I don't believe this was the writers of the Gospel's intentions, but merely resulting from their lack of spiritual awareness and their belief in duality. In the book Misquoting Jesus from the religious scholar, we find that so many of the people who copied the Bible, and we have to realize back in those days they had to copy it, hand copy it, So many of them made mistakes because they didn't even realize what it was, the sacredness of what it was that they were copying, and so many of the original manuscripts of the scriptures were lost. So they would copy and they would make mistakes, just like everybody makes mistakes. Today we call them typos. They didn't have a cut and paste or a copy and paste feature that we have now. And then later there were those who added passages to the scriptures, and then there were those who added scriptures, passages to the teachings of Jesus and to the life of Jesus, and then there were those who deleted things because they didn't understand it and they didn't understand how it wove into the rest of the scriptures. So we know that reading the scriptures literally brings us up short in understanding not only consciousness but also the life of Jesus, the teachings of Jesus, and what Jesus was trying to reveal to us, his truth that he lived by and he lived through and he lived with. So this belief in a power other than God has troubled the human mind throughout history and continues to be the predominant thought in our world today. Jesus was so convinced of the power of the Christ within him to transcend physical death that he did nothing to save himself. Nothing to save himself. He knew, as did the author of Ecclesiastes, if we look at Ecclesiastes 12:17, that the dust will return to the ground as it was, and the spirit will return to God who gave it. Oh, wow, those are powerful words. If we could just take those into our mind and really understand the fullness of the truth of them. This is Ecclesiastes 12:17. The dust will return to the ground as it was, and the spirit will return to God who gave it. And just imagine how that changes our whole outlook on life and how that changes our feelings about life and death and about this experience that we're having on planet Earth. The dust will return to the ground as it was, and the spirit will return to God who gave it. And so we know that God clothed, God intelligence, God power, God spirit clothed our spirit in human form, and that this human form will return to the dust, return to the material, but our spirit will return to God who gave it. Return to the God, the spirit, the intelligence, the power that reigns supreme and permeates everything in life, is life itself. We will return to God. Both saints and sinners. So don't even get into that nonsense of saints and sinners. Jesus said, the rain falls on the good and the bad alike. It falls on the just and the unjust. In other words, he was telling us that in God's unconditional love, God feels the presence of our spirit, feels the intention, the good intentions of our heart, and God realizes that each and every one of us in our material existence, in our humanness, will make mistakes. That God's unconditional love looks beyond our mistakes and sees us as its own image and likeness. Can we believe that? We read in the scriptures that we're created in the image and the likeness of God. That means that God sees us in God's own image and likeness, intelligence and power and spirit, and light and truth and life. God's image and likeness. That's how God sees us. God doesn't see us in our humanness and our failures and our weaknesses and our disappointments and our sadness and our depression and our lacks and our limitations. God sees us in its own image and likeness, and we must realize that as we lift up our thought about ourselves, develop an image of ourselves that's more like the good, more like the power of God, the intelligence of God, and the Spirit of God, and live to that greater image of ourselves, that we shall find all manner of good things happening in our lives. All manner of good things happening in our lives. Let's go back and look at those words again. This is Ecclesiastes 12:17. If anybody wants to look it up. The dust will return to the ground as it was. That means the physical body will return to the dust as it was, and the spirit will return to God who gave it. It's a powerful word. So I believe that most of us have revealed the Christ within us during our lives in some point in time, maybe just for a moment, but at least for a moment we felt that something otherworldly happening to us, although we may not have recognized it as so. Every time we have had a major disappointment or a setback and continue to keep faith with life, we have revealed the Christ within us, just as Jesus taught us to. Anytime we have felt like our situation was hopeless and that we were going it alone, but stopped and realized that God, with God all things are possible, we have revealed the Christ within us. Just as Jesus said, follow me, do as I do, believe as I believe, and you will live to that more abundant life. I have come that you may have life and you may have it more abundantly. The magnificent Jesus gave us proof that we can do all things through Christ, which strengthens us, that this was his truth, that he demonstrated it, because he depended on it, and we can too. That's why we say in our opening affirmation, I have absolute reliance upon the law of good, which is the law of God, and I know that as I keep faith with God, everything works for my good. Everything works for my good. So let's start looking at these statements one more time, and let's start realizing just how magnificent Jesus was to give of himself to such a great measure, to give of his very human life to such great measure, and to be so fearless in the face of losing his humanness and letting his spirit fade back to God, move back to the intelligence and the power and the spirit that created him and created you and me. So we must begin to understand these words in a greater way. Let's go back to those words of Eric Butterworth, who's a great, great Bible scholar, great, great religious scholar, as well as a great teacher and minister. He says, on the cross, one of the most misunderstood of the dramatic 7 last words is Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. That's spelled Sabachthani. That just tells us how that word is so open to translation, interpretation, I should say. How many of us understand that language? This is from Matthew 17:46. It has been rendered, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And Eric Butterworth tells us how unfortunate has been this mistranslation, this mistake. For if God would or could forsake this most advanced soul, which was Jesus, then what hope is there for us? And what hope is there for us? How can we, or why should we, worship and love a God who would ordain or even acquiesce in this horrible experience? So now we know that Jesus' words have been misunderstood. They had to be. They must be. And George Lanza, the world-renowned Syrian scholar and translator of the Bible from the ancient Peshitta, that's Peshitta, says that Jesus was actually saying, my God, for this I was kept. I am fulfilling my destiny. I am on the way through the dark hour to the great demonstration of resurrection and the complete fulfillment of man's divinity, So many times people go around and they talk about the cross, Jesus on the cross, but the most important thing that Jesus gave us was the resurrection, was the empty cross is what we want to see. We don't want to see anybody on the cross, not Jesus, not ourselves, not anyone. We don't want to have crosses to bear. We want to have good desires to fulfill. We don't want to have crosses to bear. We want to prosper and be blessed and realize the glory of God can be worked through our mind, our heart, and our soul to bring forth into our life experience a greater demonstration of God's perfect work through us, as us, and for us. Just as Jesus said, these things I do, and greater things than you've done you can do if you just keep faith with that principle that God is all in all, that God is everything. Look to God for everything. Worship God in spirit and in truth. The Father is a spirit, he said, and we must worship him in spirit and in truth, and realize, just as the mystic realized in Ecclesiastes 12:17, and think about how long ago that was, and how primitive the people were at that time. They still believed that the earth was flat, and they probably believed that if they went over to any great distance from the village in which they lived, they'd fall off the planet. So Ecclesiastes 12:17, we read, the dust will return to the ground as it was, and the spirit will return to God who gave it. And what an amazing word that is. And Jesus demonstrated that very word, and he came back through the resurrection, through the energy of his soul, through the energy of his power of his consciousness, and revealed himself so that we could all see that our life being a part of God, our spirit being a part of God's spirit, our intelligence being a part of God's intelligence, that image, likeness of God, spirit, life, and truth, that we all have an eternal life. That the life of the spirit cannot die. That God is eternal, and as part of God, we too are eternal. And so as we take those words into our mind and we understand them in a greater way and realize, just as Jesus did, that we can become fearless. The world may take away our human form, but it can never take the spirit in which God clothed us, clothed our spirit in human form. It can never take away that spirit which lives in God, as a part of God, eternally. In him we live and move and have our being. Not only do we do that here, we live in the Spirit, we're of the Spirit, we're being a spirit, having a human experience. Not only is that happening here, but in him we live and move and have our being in the hereafter as well. In the hereafter as well. So let's just know and let's understand that Jesus gave us this truth, this great truth that we must all understand, this great truth that we all must realize, this great truth that brings us a greater joy and a feeling of security and protection and knowing and believing that all those who we have loved that have passed on before us, they passed on to life, to a new adventure, to a new realization of their relationship with God and to life itself. And so as we begin to develop in our consciousness by following Jesus, by learning to believe what he believed, by learning to do those things that are greater than we've done before, and to realize that as we receive that we can give out into this world a greater measure of the givingness and the livingness and the forgivingness of God, then we too shall find and discover that Christ within us that Jesus was teaching everyone to discover within themselves. There is that within each and every one of us that Jesus tells us we must discover. He said, you are the light of the world, so let your light so shine, and that light is that spark of the divine within you and me and within everyone. And so it is. Amen. Once again, I want to thank you for being